not just at the individual species level that we've been hearing kind of a lot about so far this week. And we can look at multiple species and look at their responses to see what might be going on, infer changes in the environment that maybe we can't see, infer aspects of habitat quality that are hard to measure. And we want to do that again to overall conserve this diversity. Again, Katie mentioned the big paper that came out last year from in the journal Science, but basically bird populations are plummeting, and it is a bummer. A little bit more context as well is that we know, all of us probably know at least to some extent, that the landscape of Minnesota has changed and is continuing to change. And so this is just a land cover change map from 1890 to 1990. And we can see that things have changed. Certainly we've had a lot of conversion to agriculture in the southern parts of the state. While the northeastern part of the state has remained largely forested, the composition of those forests have changed over time. And what does this mean for species that are adapted or rely on really unique and specific habitats and features? That's some of the things I want to address here today. And so here's how I was feeling yesterday after some of it as well. You know, that's a bummer. We know a lot about habitat, things are declining, but what can we really do about it? And I always feel with a lot of science and management as well, there's just a lot of data, but what's the information? What can we do? What's the action steps that we can make to improve these conditions that are likely not going to improve themselves? And so that was my revamp of my talk that I did yesterday. And so what I did is looked at the different scales, again, of habitats that we've been talking about. And the data that I'll be sharing is from a lot of different projects over a very long time span, really just focused on forest birds, from stands to forest habitats, and then also larger landscape considerations. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about what is quality habitat. And so this is so I'm a teacher at heart, right? So I like conceptual mock-ups. And so this is what I like to think about for the very basics of how does energy flow and productivity and habitat actually contribute to some of these increases in population. So at the very start of everything, we have the beautiful sun that sometimes shines in Duluth, but rarely, that contributes to photosynthesis, right? But then we go through the trophic cascade, and somehow we get food. And depending on the individual species, this might be insects, it might be the plants themselves. Either way, we have energy inputs into an individual or into a population as food. Some of that food is digestible, some of it is not. Overall, the individual gets the net energy. And then here's where the habitat really comes in handy, is that we're talking about habitat or cover, or habitat characteristics really contribute to energy conservation. And the less energy an individual has to spend keeping warm, finding food, and just maintaining a basal metabolism, the more energy it'll have during the breeding season to increase its overall reproduction and survival, and therefore fitness. And so quality habitats really are those that provide a reliable and consistent food resource, that minimize the amount of movement that they have to do. They're hiding from predators, defending a territory, all that kind of good stuff, to minimize the risk of death, which is getting eaten a lot of times or dying by big storms for forest birds in our work. And so quality habitats can maximize individual productivity. And if we do that at a large enough scale, of course, it can increase populations. And I think that is really exciting because we're talking a lot about habitat management. And we really want to think about not just managing habitat because it's something to do to make us feel better about how much we've wrecked the world, but also because it can actually increase populations if we do it in a thoughtful way. So I sort of came up with these 4 paradigms of this presentation, things that I think no matter what agency, or if we're a forest or a wildlife person or a game biologist or a non-game person, 4 things that I think broadly most people that care about ecology could probably agree on. I might be wrong, but it's Zoom, so you can't interrupt me, so it's fine. One is that certainly we want to keep forested lands forested. And we've been doing a really good job of that in Minnesota. And in fact, we've had an increase in some forest lands as we converted some ag in that transitional zone back into forest, but we really want to think about quality habitat in those forests now. Two, in terms of wildlife, but also tree species and plant species and all that other stuff. And I will say wildlife, when I say it, is all the wildlife, right? All the birds, not just the things that we hunt. But so wildlife, we want to keep common species common. And then we also want to conserve biodiversity. And when we conserve biodiversity, we want to think about those species that might be limited because they are habitat specialists or they've had big decreases in their population. So those threatened and endangered or just generally species of conservation concern. So we want to give some special thought to those. And the world is changing. The world is different, right? And how we've done management in the past, maybe we need some tweaking. It's not that we've done it wrong. In fact, I would argue Minnesota has done a wonderful, amazing job with both forest management and wildlife, but we need to prepare for the future. And if we want things to be different and look different, then we have to do different things. And that's hard for some of us, for all of us, actually. So that's sort of the big picture. So now I'll go into my science-based recommendations, but what do we know from different stands of different cover types all the way up to the landscape? So I'll start first with everybody's favorite aspen stands. Aspen, of course, is a very important timber market species for our forest industry. It's widespread across the forest landscape. And we know that we harvested a lot, and there's a lot of BMPs or best management recommendations that are associated with management. And one of the studies that we published recently was looking at the Minnesota Forest Resource Council voluntary site management guidelines that are specifically associated with tree retention. And so the MFRC recommends either having clumps of at least 5% of the site area and about 1/4 of an acre, or you can do scattered trees, 6 to 12 per acre, or they recommend doing a combination of the two. And our question was really basic. We've been doing this for since the mid-90s. Most foresters are very compliant with leaving these tree retentions. And we just wanted to look back and say, well, was this adequate? Is this good enough? Is there more we could do to improve or do more to mitigate the impacts to wildlife, is I guess the phrasing that they use. So we had two different study designs. One was an experimental study design that you can see here in this area, where we were looking at a factorial combination of scattered versus clump trees. And the comparison was to clear cuts, no tree retention. And then our second study design was looking at more of an observational approach, where we looked at over 60 recently harvested stands and tried to characterize tree retention and then the forest bird response to tree retention across that broader landscape. So the results from the experimental design showed that for breeding birds, clear cuts were no good. They had much lower abundance, diversity, and species richness for breeding birds. There was not a significant difference between the clumped treatments or aggregated treatments and the dispersed treatments. Whatever leaf trees there were, good stuff for birds. For these experimental treatments, we also looked at small mammal communities in the fall. And here we saw a difference. And basically the small mammal abundance and diversity was higher in the clumped stands. And that's because we had species like redback bull, that's more of a mature forest species, that were coming in and actually using those clumps. If you're a person that's like, who cares about voles and mice, you can care because they are food for bigger things that you might care about, like fishers and martins and whatnot. And so having those resources available across a recently harvested stand might be valuable in some ways, but also those trees provide cavities and a sort of mature little pocket as that stand goes through succession over time. So don't do clear cuts. Yes, tree retention, scattered or clumped, it's all good. When we looked at the sort of broader conditions of tree retention, we found that people are doing a lot of really interesting things, but in general, if you want to promote diversity, and specifically breeding bird diversity, increasing the amount of tree retention within a harvest stand and having a more clumpy tended to increase diversity, because then again, you are bringing in some of the mature forest bird species. Now, we talked a little bit about in the past few weeks past few days, about habitat quality. And this was just a metric of breeding birds. And so that's another sort of layer that we need to address is, were they being successful in actually having chicks and surviving in some of these clump stands? But if we're talking about diversity, if you work in an area where you have some autonomy about how much tree you can leave, how many leaf trees you can leave on a cut, definitely towards the clumpier and the higher end, or surpassing the MFRC recommendations is definitely valuable. So the take home, at a minimum, do the BMPs, do more if possible. Other things that were really beneficial for breeding birds were softening the edges. So this is a LiDAR point cloud. You can see this is a really nice stand that had high diversity, and it had sort of a feathering in of trees into the open areas, and that was very useful for a lot of different birds as well. And Katie and Amanda did a nice job talking about forestry for the birds and different forest management techniques yesterday. And so I would just maybe refer you back if you work in an area that's an option or an opportunity. Northern hardwood stands. So we just heard from the Aiken County. We had the opportunity to work with Aiken County for many, many years, and they have a lot of northern hardwood forest stands. And a lot of times the northern hardwood stands are, we just take out individual trees. And what they wanted to do back in the 90s when they started doing this is they wanted to make bigger cuts or bigger gaps, these sort of half-acre gaps, to get rid of the canopy to promote oak regeneration. But also they didn't want to mess up the bird community, right? They didn't want to change it to an early successional stand. They wanted to maintain a mature forest bird community. And so we have a couple of different projects working on it, but in general, I don't know how well that graphic could show up, but in general, those little half-acre gap cuts increase diversity because you get some of the early successional species like American redstart or chestnut-sided warbler that sort of pop in there in like an open canopy. But you're also not losing mature forest species. And so the way that they've been managing their hardwoods is a really great and interesting compromise for keeping the forest bird community intact while getting the returns for their actual forest regen and maintaining those stands long term. And this is a great example of adaptive forest management, where they contacted us when they knew they were doing something different and they wanted an ecosystem sort of level assessment to see, hey, not just regen, but what about wildlife? And birds do respond, breeding birds do respond very quickly after a harvest. And again, with looking at both the community and the individual species, we can get a pretty good idea about that ecological value associated with that. Red pine stands. So red pine stands, we don't do a lot of work in, but in general, the more that you thin them, the diversity increases for birds because the structural diversity increases. If you work on a type of land where you have the opportunity to manage them in more of an ecological approach, managing red pines as part of a multi-age mixed species stand would be probably pretty valuable for diversity. I know some of that's going on in Minnesota, and call me, we'd love to monitor that and see how that changes over time. Okay, so that's sort of that stand level, but we also want to think about habitats and move up to landscapes as well. So one of the things, with the sort of charge almost that Eli keeps talking about is we want patches of different structures and cover types across the landscape. Well, how we even recognize what those patches look like or how we categorize them really, really matters. And so forestry in traditionally, we talk about the dominant tree species and the dominant age class of that tree species, so pole aspen. But when we looked at sites from our long-term monitoring areas, specifically this is data from the Superior National Forest, only 21 out of 1,000 sites had an actual dominant tree species. So that means maybe that approach for naming the stands doesn't really fit with what's out on the landscape. And certainly it might not fit with how the birds are seeing those stands. And so we said, is this a problem? And asked the birds, how do you see the forest? So we did a cluster analysis and all fancy things that you don't care about, but I'd be happy to talk to you about off of this Zoom. And we found that there's actually 11 things that I'm introducing to the world that I'm calling native bird communities, NBCs, not NPCs. There's 11 in Superior National Forest. And really it's the cluster of birds that are responding similarly to features on the landscape that are sort of independent of different trees. So if you look at this, we call this NBC number 1, deciduous mixed, and it's really a lot of stands that have a large deciduous component, but also mixed conifer component as well. There are 3 bird species that are highly tied to this kind of stand type: black-throated green warbler, northern parula, and black-throated blue warbler. And our trends indicate that they're all increasing. And we can look at that information holistically and together and say, good job, Superior National Forest. You're probably managing in general those forest types really well. Keep doing that. On the flip side, we have another example of one of our NBCs that we call black spruce tamarack. And these are bird species that are a lowland conifer dependent sort of species. A lot of these stands had a large component of black spruce, but the age class was very different. The indicator species with these guys, they don't look so good. They're decreasing, right? And so the issue might be what's going on with lowland conifers. And so we might want to really take this information and reevaluate our long-term goals for lowland conifer and think about what might be going on and what we can do to mitigate some of the issues. So in general, the take home is that birds use forests or see forests differently than we do, but we can use that information to help guide and refine some of our forest management practices. Across the landscape, across the Great Lakes region, lowland conifer is a big issue, and it's facing a lot of different threats: climate change, ELB, eastern large beetle, which I'll talk about in a minute. And our birds we're seeing that in our bird trends. And so if we want to keep that piece of diversity, if we want to keep that on the landscape, we have to do work differently than what we've been doing in the past. And so if that's a value for your land management agency, then we need to sort of start thinking outside of the box, I think. Whoops. And then lastly, the sort of landscape perspective is that wildlife, and especially bigger wildlife than birds, use multiple forest stands at any given time, right? And so we want to make sure that those features that they need across time and across space are available. This is mostly just an excuse to show this adorable little baby boreal chickadee, but because of our concern about lowland conifers, we have big projects in a lot of the forested peatlands. And just really quickly, we just think about maybe forested peatlands or lowland conifer is all kind of the same, but there's some really interesting nuances about how boreal chickadees are using the forest. So the breeding habitat is a lot more dense trees, a more diverse understory, but post-fledgling, so after they leave their parents and they're hanging out with a bunch of little teenage birds, other kinglets, other chickadees, they go to these really tall, mature forest stands that have more of an open understory. And we have to make sure that those age classes and those structures are all available across that, that forested peatland landscape as well. And I don't know if our forest management techniques are necessarily doing that, that well at this point. Similarly, if we think about more of a deciduous or managed forest, we see something similar with woodcock. Again, we are tagging woodcock, and what their features that they're responding to is really fine scale details, leaves, shrub density, and down trees, and they don't care about age, cover type. They're really just looking at for anything where they can hide. And so there's a woodcock, there's some babies there, there's a woodcock there. Their jam is hiding, and so that's how they survive. Lastly, the landscape perspective, again, there's sort of 3 in general cover types that I think we could think more about. Old forests, we're seeing decreasing trends in a lot of species that rely on old forests. Black ash or forested wetlands, we have threats from emerald ash borer. And then tamarack, which is part of that peatland component, we're having a lot of threats from eastern larch beetle. Those are going to be limiting factors for conserving biodiversity. And so landscape level planning should all address some of those issues. So as we think about maintaining those patch sizes, maintaining those age classes, those are some of the things I know, and there's obviously a lot of things I don't know. But what does the future hold? It's exciting because we get to reimagine it together and sort of conserve and manage in a really holistic way, and that's awesome. So I think with that, I have maybe a minute left. But would like to thank all of our collaborators and all of our long-term partners and all the awesome people that I get to work with every day.